Hi everyone, this is Zachary from NonLocality Software with another Unreal Engine tutorial. Today's tutorial will cover how to do weapon systems for the third-person character using Blueprint. Before we get started today, we'll need some art assets. The first art asset is the Animation Starter Pack, which is free in the Marketplace tab of your Unreal Engine launcher. Once you've added that to the project, then you'll also need a render of your weapon. In my Blueprint folder, I've created another folder called Gun with two subfolders, one for renders and one for sounds. In my project, I will be using 2D sprites left over from my mobile game War on Zombies, but you will most likely be using a 3D model, so the concept is the same. The other thing you'll need will be sounds for your weapons. You'll need a variety of sounds to make your weapons convincing, but today I'll just be using the firing sounds for each weapon. When you have all of your art assets together, then we can work in the blueprints. Before setting up these blueprints, we'll need a few variables. These variables we're going to put in our gun folder because they're related to the gun system. If you right-click in the content browser and go to your Blueprints tab, you'll see what's called enumeration. We'll need one of those. Enumeration, as I've talked about before, are really useful for lists of items, which is what we're going to do today. We're going to name this type gun. Control S to save. We're going to open that up. We're going to have one entry for each weapon, and then one for empty, which we're going to call none. No weapon. The first one will be called pistol. The second will be called rifle. The third one will be called sniper. So this is just an arbitrary list to store what weapons we have. The second item we'll need will also be in the Blueprints tab, and it will be called a structure. A structure is like an array in that it can hold multiple items, but it can hold multiple types of variables, whether in singular or array form, which is really useful for holding together bundles of settings. I'll be naming this settings gun. I'm going to open that up. I'm working off of a previous project here. What we'll need are about 5 variables. The first variable will be the type gun that we just did. Type, it has to be an underscore, you can't do spaces in a structure. Be type gun. I'm going to change that to the type gun variable class. We're going to add another one. This one will be the clip size of your weapon. We need to know how many bullets the weapon can hold. And we'll use an integer. We don't need a float. An integer is a whole number. A float can be fractional. We don't care about fractional bullets. We want whole bullets. We'll also need to know the current size of the current clip. I'm going to call that current clip size. This will be how many bullets we have left. We want to know what our reload time is, how long it takes to reload the weapon. So reload underscore time. And this we can do a float, because we can have a fractional second. And we need to know fire rate, the rate of fire for the weapon. And that will also be in float. We can minimize the structure here and only have the values. Makes it easier to read. These will be the default values anytime you use the settings. if we set it up for pistol, I'm going to make the clip size 10. We'll assume that we start with a full clip. Reload time, we'll say 2 seconds. Firing time, 1 bullet for every half second. Maybe quick, but that's what I want to do. So now we've got our setting structure for the weapon and the type of guns that we can use. Before we set up the weapon system, we'll also need a projectile to fire. So we're going to create a new actor class for the bullet. Right click, create blueprint class, select actor as the base class, and we'll simply name this bullet. Control S to save. We're going to open that up. Now the first thing we need to add to this is a projectile movement component. So if you search in here, you can actually just type in projectile and we'll get a projectile movement component. When you add this, it adds a function allowing the actor to have projectile movement. It's pretty straightforward. If we click on the projectile movement component, we can modify the values over here. I'm going to open this up a little bit more. The first value we want to change is the velocity. The velocity here determines what direction and what speed we should be going. We just want to go 3,000 units along the x-axis, and that will give us a good enough speed. File and save. That's the only thing we need to modify. We want, since the sound of a gunfire is actually the bullet shell, we want the sound to come from the bullet and not the gun. So we're going to spawn an attached sound. So click spawn sound attached. And we can get the default scene root here and attach to that. So wherever the bullet goes, this sound will follow. The sound, we have multiple sounds, and so the way to choose from multiple sounds is from a selector node. So we pull that out and we get a select, and the select will return the value at the index. So we want to make the index whatever type of gun this is being fired from. So going to create a variable called type gun and change it to the correct variable type. Once again, type gun, compile it, and we want to make this editable. Not only do we want to make it editable, but we want to make it exposed upon spawn. So whenever we create a bullet inside of another blueprint, we need to be able to tell this blueprint to read this value a certain way from the beginning. Meaning we can change this before the event begin play even begins. So we want to click on this eye here, make that editable, and you can do the same over here in the details panel. But click on this, make it editable, and then we want to make it exposed on spawn as well. So whenever we create this actor class, we can change that variable before it begins play. So we're going to pull out that variable and we're going to plug it into the index. So now we've got an index of our 3 weapons and a none entry as well. The pistol, we want to have the pistol firing sound, the rifle firing sound, and the sniper firing sound. So whenever this actor begins play, it will create a sound that will attach to its root component, and it'll pick the sound based off of what type of gun we've been told we were fired from, and then it'll play the sound from there. We also want to tell the bullet to damage things. Now we won't cover damage systems in this tutorial, but we will do it in a future tutorial. But we're going to go ahead and set up the bullet to put out damage right off the bat. And to do that, we need to know if the bullet collides with something. In order to have that, we must have a component with collision. So I'm going to add my bullet sprite that I had from earlier. I'm going to add a paper sprite. You will probably be using a small bullet model. Some people prefer to just use a particle effect with a tracer on it. It's all up to you. I'm going to use my paper sprite here and just call it bullet render. Then we go to our viewport tab. You can see it here. Source sprite, bullet render sprite. I'm going to rotate it so it's facing the correct angle. And that's it. Go back to our event graph. Select bullet render. If you go in the details panel, you can see events. We want on component begin overlap. I'm going to add that. So whenever the bullet render overlaps another object, or actually we want to use hit instead. Overlap is if the object will pass through it. Hit is if it collides with it, which the bullet will. So if the bullet collides with another object, then what we want to do is apply damage to that other actor. This will output the other actor. We'll pull that out and click apply damage. And we'll just use a default value of 1. We can always change this later, or even expose it as a variable when we spawn the bullet. There's a lot of opportunities for this. But for now, the bullet blueprint is done. We now have a bullet that will fly, make sounds, and apply damage when it hits something. So now we want to open up our third-person character and start on the code for the weapon system. We're going to change some of the camera system before we get started to make sure it works better with a point-and-click shooter. We want to create an input action, and what you can do that through the Project Settings tab. If you go to Project Settings, go to Input, you can add an action mapping. We're going to add an action mapping and call it Camera Switch. I'm going to set that to be from the tab key. I'm going to tab between the two camera systems. Exit out of that. Go and compile this so it knows about the new input. Right click, camera, switch. So anytime we press tab, this input action will execute. Before we had it on the left and right mouse buttons, I'm going to be using the left mouse button to shoot later. I don't care about the right mouse button anymore. So I'm going to have this one action switch between the two states. I'm going to do that with a flip-flop node. So the flip-flop node will fire between A and B on-off, basically. First time it'll go to A, second time it'll go to B, and then back to A, then back to B. So that pretty much covers what we got to change there. We also want to take off R here as well, sorry. R we're going to be using for reloading later. And we'll hook this up with something else here in a minute. You can actually select all of this, right click, and create comment from selection. We'll use this, we'll name this camera switching, because that's all this graph does. It switches how the camera works. also got this. This is for zooming. And we're gonna create a comment for that as well. Call it zoom. And it's really useful to put these things in bubbles because it allows you to separate them out. You don't have to subconsciously pay attention to them if they have bubbles around them, because you already know what they do. Next thing we want to do is we want to add in, let me delete these, we don't need these. You need to add in your weapon render. Usually it'll be a 3D model. Like I said, I will be using a sprite for my mobile game. I'm going to add a sprite, but you could always add a mesh. That's probably what you'll end up doing. I'm going to call this gun render. And I'm going to attach this to my mesh. Now we need to change some things on the mesh as well. So we click on the mesh. Now remember when we imported the animation starter pack, we want to use that animation set instead. So you're going to click on the skeletal mesh here, and there's one already highlighted. That's the one we have right now. We're going to change it to the other one which we imported. And then under the animation tab, we want to change the animation class to this UE4 ASP animation blueprint here. So now we've got the gun stance as well. So that's our new animation blueprint. If you click compile and save and go ahead and play your game, you'll notice you've got that new system now. So now I've got my gun render. Now for the gun render, I will say that you will likely need to put a handle on it as well as a socket for the muzzle. Now you do this a little bit differently with sprites, but I'll kind of show you how it'll work. It'll work pretty much the same way with a 3D model. This is just in a 2D view, but if you go to the sockets here, you can just click this plus, it'll add a socket, you name it. I've named it muzzle because it's easy to find, and you can change the transform. So it's 210 units over 80 units up from the pivot point. You can set the pivot point to be a custom location, or you may have it, or you may give it a socket for the handle. But the pivot point for the 2D sprite is the 0, 0, 0 point. So that's pretty much it. You'll do the same thing for the 3D model, just in the 3D model editor. But I'm going to actually zero this back out, and I'm going to name the parent socket. I'm going to find hand right. So now we're attached to the right hand. You can see it's moving with it, and we just got to change it to be the right orientation. I'm going to lower. Actually, I'm going to turn off the grid snapping so I can move that. It's not going to fit perfectly because it wasn't designed for this character. There we go. So now we've updated our animation set and we've added a weapon render to our character. Now we need to start adding the variables that we're going to be playing with. The first variable we're going to want is a set of 3 gun slots. I'm going to add a new variable and call this gun slot 1. We're going to change that to a settings gun structure. Remember, that contains all the settings for a weapon. I'm going to create another variable, call it gun slot 2, and a third one called gun slot current. So this holds the value of the gun we're currently holding. This keeps a storage record of 2 other guns. You only have 2 guns in the end, but this tracks what we're currently using. The next variable you're going to need is every value within the gun slot. And the easiest way to do this, here's a little shortcut. Instead of going in and creating each variable, you can actually get the structure you want to pull from, pull it out. We're going to break it. You can break any structure with a break node. Open this up. So I'm going to pull out the first value, and there's a button here that says promote to variable. Click on that. We've now got a new variable over here, and you can see right here what it's called. We'll just keep that same name, type gun. Do the same thing with this one. And it's going to put it in the same place, so you got to grab it. We'll call this clip size. Promote to variable. Call it current clip size. Grab that. Reload time. And fire rate. So now we've created a local variable for each variable within the settings gun structure.